Hi, we're here with Fan Yang, Assistant Professor of Media and Communication Studies at UMBC, talking about her new book, Faked in China, Nation Branding, Counterfeit Culture, and Globalization. Fan, the book, it came out this year by Indiana University Press, and it's a beautiful cover. There is a rich vein of ideas in the book that we are hoping to mine a little bit today. One of the things that I thought about as I was reading the finished version was what first got you interested in this particular trope of faked in China and this notion of artifice and authenticity that sort of forms the sort of the center of the book's argument.
Sure. I can give you maybe two reasons. One is a little broad, and the other is more immediate. The broader reason, I think, growing up in China, I actually lived in various regions and places. And so I've always had this kind of curiosity about national culture. And so there's something about the constructedness of national culture that I always have been interested in. And having been places like Kennedy Center, where I worked on the China Festival, so that kind of added another layer to that curiosity as well. So that's kind of the broad picture of how I came to thinking about the nation in globalization. But more immediately, I had to trace the origin of this book to 2008, the Beijing Olympics. And if you recall, the grandiose spectacle of the opening ceremony kind of wowed the world, but then really quickly, there was this other set of spectacles that emerged from the global news media. Do you remember at all what I'm talking about?
I do, but partly because you're my colleague and friend. I do.
Yeah, so, well, if you recall, it was there were two instances of fake charges. One of them was about this one little girl who's very pretty, wearing a red dress, singing a song about the nation. And it turns out that she was lip syncing. And the real girl who was supposed to be singing that song, she was deemed not photogenic enough. And so that was one of the incidents of fakes. And then the other one was the 29 kind of choreographed firework footprints that supposedly brought the Olympian spirit into the stadium turned out to be pre-recorded rather than live projection. So those two instances of fake kind of got me interested in thinking about, okay, well, there were lots of other instances of, say, pre-recorded footage in live events, mediated events, and then there were also lots of lip-syncing cases in historical events of this kind. And so why now? Why China is kind of blamed very specifically and using such terms as fake and not necessarily lip syncing. So I kind of wrote an article about it, and it ended up being one of my first peer-reviewed journal articles, which is about those fake incidences. And what I kind of argued in that piece was that it has something to do with China being in the present, in the real time environment with the West. And so that kind of triggers some kind of anxiety on the part of the Western news media. And so, of course, that's coming from the Western perspective. And one of the presence or experiences of China in our everyday life in the West, of course, is the Made in China label that you see a lot of merchandises and clothes, right? And so that's coming from the Western perspective. And then started thinking about from the Chinese perspective. In some ways, it's also one of those instances where the Chinese state originally wanted to put on this great show for the global news media, but somehow ended up losing control in offering meanings about the nation. And so that also got me thinking about both levels of the global and the national. And so I would kind of trace the origin of this book to that.
Excellent. It's fascinating, and it's fascinating to think particularly about a Western media to some extent dominated by an American media sensibility that helped to drive a lot of these constructions of China's faking it. Certainly that's been a hot topic of discourse in terms of the industrial manufacturing base that has been lost, Americans say, from the United States to China in terms of making things, but also in terms of these global spectacles. Particularly because America, prior maybe to this 21st century moment of China's ascendance onto not only the world stage with the Olympics, but as you argue with their entry to the World Trade Organization in 2001, that's another critical moment in your book. But America has always been the great big fake, right? The P.T. Barnum, and think about Baudrillard writing about America as this sort of place where you go to see the simulacra of the rest of the world. And so being a fake and being a showman and making things out of nothing and being a bit of a hustler and bringing a lot of moxie and a lot of flash has been a part of a very proud tradition of American preeminence in the 20th century that's really seen as sort of one of the great features that helps to explain America's rise. So it's interesting that it gets interpreted in this more hostile way for China in the 21st century. So I was wondering if you were thinking about any parallels about that, and is there a sense in your argument that there's nothing China could have done in the 2008 Olympics on the ground or through the media to forestall these kinds of arguments, that it was sort of the game was set and there was no way sort of out of that kind of representation?
That's a very interesting question. I want to say I appreciated that you pointing out the historical precedence of fate in America. And so a lot of the critics of the intellectual property rights regime, which is one of my key objects of analysis, indeed pointed out that, well, a lot of the charges that American, say, government or politicians have against China are really ignoring those historical events of faking in America, perhaps intellectual property rights thefts from Europe, European print culture. That was one of the examples that some of the scholars would mention.
America has a proud history of stealing intellectual copyright from Europe, yes.
So for me, the question of faked in China, or a lot of the artifacts that we hear about in the news media about artifacts being kind of manufactured without any regard for intellectual property rights, what I call a regime. To me, that has to be kind of situated in the very historically specific moment, which, as you mentioned, China entered the WTO in 2001, and that meant an intensification of the integration of that economy into the global circuit. And so the volume of made in China in many ways created sort of the foundation for the kinds of practices, what I'm calling kind of counterfeit cultural practices. And so there's a very intricate link between, say, made in China and faked in China that I actually do lay out in the book. But at the same time, I want to say that this kind of global attention to made in China has also created, in some sense, a particular kind of policy directive in the Chinese environment, specifically in relation to the state practice of, say, nation branding, the term that I use to kind of describe this goal of upgrading the nation's economy from a model based on made in China toward one that's based on created in China. So the difference between them, of course, is one is only manufacturing for the world's global brands, and created in China would mean producing the kinds of goods that are themselves eligible for intellectual property rights. And so this kind of notion of brand imaginary is what I try to talk about in the book as something that has influenced how the Chinese government thinks about its own nation, and how perhaps those people or publics who participate in counterfeit cultural practices in some ways contest both that kind of trajectory of the nation's development as well as the intellectual property rights regime that kind of gave rise to that. So that's something that interested me a lot and got me thinking.
And I guess that was probably my favorite part of the book, was that you don't merely set these two things in tension, the sort of the global imaginary that sort of put China into this place as this gauche interloper, or as this producer of fakes, or as this top-down government that sort of can't do anything honest. And on the other hand, the Chinese state's attempt to respond to that. You also sort of situate in this third space these makers, these people, these makers of meanings, among other things, who find neither of those particular positions to be satisfying culturally or personally. And so I was wondering if you could maybe, for those of our listeners or viewers who haven't had an opportunity to read the book yet, but maybe they do remember the 2008 Olympics opening ceremony, what are some other readings that you perform in this book that you think show this particular three-way dynamic in ways that might be interesting?
Sure, yeah. So not too long after the Olympics, I took a trip back to China, and one of the things that really struck me was a media buzzword for 2008 wasn't really the Olympics. It was this word called shanzhai. So literally, the term is made up of two words, shan referring to mountain, and zhai referring to fortress or stronghold. So combined, the word really kind of has this connotation of counter state or against kind of official, or even sort of a Robin Hood righteousness to it. And so why is this term kind of got so much attention at that point? Well, it's a catchword for all things fake. And so you can talk about shanzhai Gucci bags and shanzhai celebrity, or shanzhai spectacle events such as the China Central Television's annual Spring Festival Gala. And so this term became sort of a signifier of fake. And
but not in the way that knockoff might in the United
Exactly.
States. Knockoff merely doesn't have the kind of populist, it's more derogatory.
It actually had this kind of transformation in the Chinese mediascape, which I kind of trace in one of my chapters. And so to kind of give you the brief outline of that chapter, I kind of try to trace the origin of this term back to its kind of material formation. So I noticed that the way that this term emerged was having something to do with the migrant workers who moved from the countryside to places like Shenzhen near Hong Kong, where a lot of the subcontracting firms for like global tech companies such as Apple had been relocated. And so the migrant workers being away from home and right at the moment where a new technology like mobile phones kind of became not just a status symbol for the elite, but more like a working class technology, as Jack Chiu would call it. They were the people that kind of made this bandit brand of shanzhai kind of visible in the mass media landscape. And so that was kind of the moment that I traced back to. And then I also trace this discourse of shanzhai to two other moments. So the second one is actually how it got taken up by lots of people talking about shanzhai culture online. So I kind of discussed that as a transformation of a new media technology use to sort of a cultural formation of this technology discourse. So one of the things that really struck me was people who cataloged Shanzhai cell phones on these websites often sort of celebrated its shock value because some of them just kind of look ridiculous, or they just had like all these functions that you would not even imagine the legit brands would even have. So like super duper long battery charge time, and also maybe 2 SIM cards instead of 1, and just really outrageous aesthetics and also technical capabilities. And
that
so
are superior to
in
the
some ways, yes,
to the original
and
brand in some
they
cases.
are cheaper. And so one of the reasons that they were popular among the working class. And so so it was interesting to see how Shanzhai really is simultaneously a discourse about new technology and a discourse that's mediated by these technologies, including the internet. And so, so after tracing that kind of formation from, say, the mobile phone sector in South China to the internet, I also look at how, say, the state media talked about this particular cultural formation. And what I noticed in one of the key segments on China Central Television's news report, which is one of the kind of signature programs that the station had for a long time. And what's interesting there is, on the one hand, it's acknowledging that, wow, there's this Shanzhai phone sector that is happening, and in some ways that's kind of really exciting. But at the same time, it immediately kind of turned the attention to, say, the middle class consumer who might be duped by these fake brands. And so to me, that's kind of a symptom of how this notion of a consumer citizen is really the privileged subject for the state, whereas the working class base that gave rise to Shanzhai as a bandit brand was kind of erased from that kind of privileging. And so that's why I kind of look at discourses and artifacts like that to think about how nation branding and counterfeit culture both are kind of manifestations of the intellectual property rights regime, but they also kind of offer competing visions for the nation. So,
Fascinating. That's great. And one of the things that it seems like this analysis brings to the fore is that not only do China's attempts at kind of branding itself as a nation point to some of the problems of thinking in terms of national identity at this late stage of globalization, but Shanzhai also poses a potential crisis for the notion of brands too. If there's a kind of cachet to the knockoff, to the fake, and if the manufacturing regimes in those parts of China where this manufacturing is taking place are so wildly efficient and so tenuously controlled by the brands that are first world brands, then why do I need an Apple, right? An Apple computer or an iPhone when I could have something that has a longer battery life? I mean, it seems also that in addition to the privileged citizen consumer, it's the brand itself that's also being defended in some of these media scares, right?
Right, yeah, so that's kind of how I talk about the operation of the brand imaginary. As cultural studies people, we always try to denaturalize what has been taken for granted. And so this distinction between the brand and the counterfeit, of course, has to do with the construction of intellectual property rights as this lexicon, as this legal regime, as this kind of cultural apparatus. And so that's where I trace kind of this kind of global formation has had an impact on, say, the Chinese nation state. state. And indeed, intellectual property rights is, I think, a privileged side to look at that, because to me, as the example of Olympics might present, it really indicates sort of a moment where the relation or the kind of alignment between, say, nation and culture on the one hand, and state and power on the other are really destabilized. And that's why I felt it really is worth looking into as a lens to think about nation and globalization.
Great. You mentioned cultural studies as sort of one of your intellectual homes at the beginning of that response, and the book is marked as cultural studies and Asia and cultural studies, and then Amazon, I noticed, marks it under the category of politics. And you are yourself in, as am I, Department of Media and Communication Studies. Talk a little bit about discipline and interdisciplines and how thinking across disciplines helped you come up with this particular framework for this work.
Thank you for that question. I do think about interdisciplinary work a lot, and I really appreciate the fact that I work in this interdisciplinary department where many of my colleagues do the kind of work that I really enjoy reading and learning from. And so for me, there was the time when I was in training in grad school for cultural studies, I was kind of looking for models. As you know, as a student, you probably want to think, oh, what kind of book do I imagine writing? Can I have a model? And I realized there's sort of a divide in, say, Asian studies, which many would argue is sort of a co-war formation. So there's a preoccupation of the state as this kind of official entity and this communist other, if you will. And then there's the disciplines associated with East Asian studies that is more preoccupied with historic China. So some might accuse those as sort of like Orientalist, proto-Orientalist. Of course, there are lots of really great work coming out of it as well in terms of thinking about history. But then it seems like when it comes to the present, well, people asking questions about culture seem to lie between two broad categories. One is literary studies, so very much engaged with intellectual discourses about the elite kind of literature, novels, films. And then there's the anthropological discipline, which is more interested in the social. And I think one of the things that cultural studies has done is to sort of bridge those types of divides and to really think about culture as meaning-making practices of the broadest kind and the broadest possible way. And so I think I try to bring all of those perspectives together. And I wouldn't call my book a ethnography per se, but certainly, especially the chapter about the Silk Street Market in Beijing, I was very much informed by a lot of the ethnographic perspectives that I've learned in both myself and from professors in grad school. But at the same time,
talk a bit about the Silk Market.
Yeah, so the market, those of you who have been to Beijing must have visited if you were looking for souvenirs to bring back. And so historically, its formation in the 80s had a lot to do with the downsizing of state-owned enterprises of the nation, and also the opening of the Global South to global economic integration. And so the market historically was really famous as an urban counterfeit bazaar for global tourists. And however, for the government or city government to prepare the capital of Beijing for the Beijing Olympics in the beginning of 2000, 2001, 2002. The municipal government decided to transform the market into this huge kind of mall space so that it can be like better disciplined. And one of the impetus for that was also try to kind of erase the counterfeit sales that might be going on over there. But after the bazaar to mall transformation, well, you can still sort of go underground and get counterfeit artifacts if you want. And I actually personally tried that just to see how it operated. But what interested me the most was the discussions of landmark and trademark that emerged through this transformation, as well as some of the legal disputes that took place in the new mall, in the new building, like an 8-story building. And so one of the instances was 5 global brands tried to sue the vendors or actually the managing developer for the new property for infringing upon their rights. So there's Gucci and Prada and all of these like major brands. And so what's interesting about that, well, that case actually resolved in the global brands kind of sort of winning the case, which was one of the first times that this type of counterfeit sales can be subject to the IPR, the intellectual property rights regime. And so, but what's interesting to me was that, well, before the market turned into this mall, the vendors who were selling these things at the market, they were so loosely organized that they weren't in a position to be subject to legal disputes. And it was right after this kind of state's interest in protecting the public interest, but actually masking the privatization process of that urban space, that gave rise to the legal disputes that gave the global brands the opportunity to kind of secure their brand image by suing them. So I thought it was kind of interesting. And some of the vendors, when they were interviewed by some of the journalists doing investigative work at the time, actually had sayings like, none of us individuals owned this market. We were a collective. And so for me, that presented a different kind of vision about relationship, both between people and to the space of urban space that is sort of under-acknowledged by the state. But why is that? Well, that kind of had to do with the state's intent to conform to the intellectual property rights regime by branding the nation for the global gaze and trying to turn this market into a place where you can get silk and other types of kind of Chineseness of goods. And so that's a very different kind of way of thinking about history versus the vendor's conception. And so that is an example perhaps to illustrate what I try to do as a cultural studies person. So meaning making doesn't necessarily only lie in the space of like literary production, but also in social production. And also I do include a film as an artifact as well. So I think that I was sort of ambitious in a way to try to do all kinds of analysis of culture as meaning making. So we'll see.
And that breadth of curiosity and that breadth of creativity is a hallmark of the kinds of cultural studies that you've been drawn to in your graduate studies and also at UMBC in Media and Communication Studies, where we tend to have a pretty broad notion about what qualifies as objects of critical curiosity and study.
Right.
So just a sort of a last question, you mentioned, you described Shanzhai as sort of a moving target semiotically when you first discovered its use in China and then its use sort of in the media. What is the state of the word now in 2016?
Well, it's interesting to observe in the hottest social media platform, WeChat or Weixin, you would still constantly receive one of those posts that, here's the 10 shocking Shanzhai things that China has produced or created. And then I do also have friends who are continuously interested in thinking about Shanzhai culture as this unfolding phenomenon that, and actually that gets at one of the kind of theoretical resource that I draw on, which is post-colonial studies. And so there are narratives about Shanzhai phones. Actually, I do talk about this in the book a little bit. The fact that a phone brand like Xiaomi, sort of, for some, would be considered a Shanzhai brand in the very beginning. Of course, now perhaps toward a more legit category. But of course, it's hugely popular in places like India. And so one of the things I want to do in this book is try to maybe use these type of cultural analyses to reposition China, not as a sort of superpower in contention with the so-called declining superpower, but rather maybe try to reposition China in sort of the global south, which you may wonder, like, oh yeah, there's the Bandung in the 50s, where China kind of emerged as the third world leader. But then in the contemporary times, you might argue that China's operation in places like Africa is very much subject to sort of the US-led neoliberalization practices. So that kind of complexity is really warranting more critical attention. And I feel that by looking at counterfeit practices, say that circulated from China perhaps to other parts of the global south, whether it's Africa or India, maybe there are some interesting things to think about as this kind of south-north contestation.
Right.
So
excellent.
Yeah, so lots of more work to be done with Shanzhai still.
I said that was my last question, but I just want to add one more because it's I thought of it as you were answering. Is there a way in which the sort of rehabilitation of a Shanzhai product into a brand sort of suggests the argument of the conquest of cool, or sort of the capitalism's ability to recuperate anything? And I also sort of thought about the processes in contemporary US culture where hipsters will sort of take up down market things intentionally to try to signal their own authenticity, their own freedom from consumer trends, and perhaps maybe even to demonstrate their own powers to confer onto ordinary objects a kind of new cachet. Is there any danger of that happening here when you have these websites that are now available around the world to sort of celebrate the 10 most Shanzhai things? Is there becoming a kind of an upmarket audience for these downmarket brands?
I probably would save that question to some of my friends who are still doing research for it. I do want to say, though, at the moment of concluding my book, one of the biggest arguments I try to make is there's this kind of competing notion of what culture does. And so in the Nation Branding Project, the conception is that culture is considered a resource for value making, whereas you see more in counterfeit cultural practices, culture is a resource for meaning making. And so for me, that kind of opens up some ways of thinking about culture and perhaps offering some opportunity to disrupt this sort of predictable trajectory of something hip or cool and sort of countercultural got very quickly co-opted by, say, the branding regime. And so I think that's why I try to kind of be nuanced about what culture means in all those situations. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. I hope that our discussions have whetted your appetite for Faked in China, Nation Branding, Counterfeit Culture, and Globalization. My guest here has been Fan Yang, Assistant Professor of Media and Communication Studies. Get the book,